picture of Cassius Marcellus Clay, which unfortunately has been quite overshadowed by the naming of Muhammad Ali's original name. They're not related, but there is a connection in the sense that Muhammad Ali's father, I think, went to this college that I'm going to talk about and was named after Cassius Clay, which he passed down to his son. So in 1845, Cassius Marcellus Clay of Lexington, Kentucky, proclaimed himself the first to ever beard the monster in his den when he founded True American, an anti-slavery newspaper. He was the son of a prominent Southern plantation owner. However, he heard Garrison's speeches and he immediately freed his slaves, and then a year later he set up this anti-slavery paper. So a realist, he fireproofed his print shop that was printing this anti-slavery paper, since it wasn't popular with a lot of people. He fireproofed it with iron, positioned 2 cannons at the door. He's quite a character. He's very, and as you'll see, he got along with the Russians really well. Clay's hubris so inflamed the neighbors that while he was sick at home, only then did the mob dare to empty the premises. Clay moved his printing operation to Cincinnati, continuing to edit at his Lexington office. After giving a speech in Texas denouncing slavery in 1849, he single-handedly fought off 6 attackers. Clay's fiery opposition to slavery would come to encompass the system's impact on whites as well. Slavery, he vehemently argued, hurt the South and its white workers. The North was radiant with railroads, the channels of her untold commerce, whilst the South hobbles on at immeasurable distance behind. Instead of retreating into wealth and the privileged life of a Southern planter, Clay campaigned ardently against slavery, decrying its harm to blacks and to poor whites. In 1899, in Kentucky, the Berea College, which you see a picture of here, student body was visibly more racially diverse than its counterparts around the nation. And this was because they were very influenced by Cassius Marcellus Clay, who was born in Kentucky and shaped the thoughts of the people there. It was also one of the few colleges, I think, to admit women students as well. In 1912, the tuition-free institution reached out to needy students across Appalachia, a gesture recalling Clay's antebellum interest in educating poor whites. Berea's motto, the name of the college, remains, "God has made of one blood all peoples of the earth." So there's a quote from Cassius: "It is an evil to the free laborer by forcing him by the laws of competition, supply, and demand to work for the wages of the slave, food, and shelter. The competition of unrequited service, slave labor, dooms the laboring white millions of these states to poverty. Poverty gives them over to ignorance, and ignorance and poverty are the fast high roads to crime and suffering." So again, as Martin Luther King recognized, the slavery system was not just against the black slaves, but it was to take away the humanity of everyone, and it was to also keep white people in poverty. As the story goes, Cassius Clay was too volatile, bombastic of a person to lead a regiment, according to Lincoln. I don't know why he had those thoughts. So Lincoln suggested that he become the ambassador to Spain, and Cassius Clay was like, how about ambassador to Russia? And so he started his historical position as ambassador to Russia. He's probably the greatest U ambassador to Russia that has ever held that position, which he held in 1861 to 62 and then 63 to 69. So he quickly made steadfasting relations. They say, because Tsar Alexander II, he freed his serfs that year, they say that Cassius Clay actually played a role in, obviously Tsar Alexander II was thinking of doing this already, but that Cassius got the ball rolling, and that year that he went into Russia, Tsar Alexander II freed the serfs, which were 23 million in number.
Wow, 23 million.
Yeah. He also became good friends with the Dashkova family, which he frequently cited in his memoirs, another indication that the Dashkova family are Republicans. Clay was also going to play as the key negotiator for the Alaska purchase with Seward, which I'll go through in more detail later. So in 1861, the Emancipation Edict was passed and successfully carried out by Tsar Alexander II, which would free 23 million serfs. This was by no means a simple task, for there was much resistance met and required an amazing degree of statesmanship on the part of Tsar Alexander II. And here's a quote that he said to the marshals of nobility in 1856, so 5 years before he would do this. He states, "You can yourself understand that the present order of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for that time when it starts to abolish itself from below, as in a rebellion or a revolution. I ask you to think about the best way to carry this out." So he's giving them time. You know, it's a lot to think about, 23 million serfs to be freed, but it's going to happen. Do I have any more notes here? The success of this edict would go down in history as one of the greatest accomplishments for human freedom, and Tsar Alexander II would become known as the Great Liberator, for which he was beloved around the world, though we don't hear about those sorts of things today. Shortly after, in 1863, President Lincoln would pass the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are and henceforward shall be free. The British are really the reason why the Civil War, why it reached a situation where the United States was ready to tear itself into, not just even two, but into pieces. It probably wouldn't have been two parts, it would have been pieces. And there's a very interesting quote by Lord Robert Cecil, who was a member of Parliament at the time. He would later become Marquess of Salisbury, which is a very distinguished title in Britain, and he would be the British Prime Minister 3 times. So we should take note to what he says. During the Civil War, he states, "The northern states of America never can be our sure friends because we are rivals. Rivals politically, rivals commercially. With the southern states, the case is entirely reversed. The population are an agricultural people. They furnish the raw materials of our industry, and they consume the products which we manufacture from it. With them, every interest must lead us to cultivate friendly relations, and when the war began, they at once recurred to England as their natural ally." Sounds a bit like a colony. So this is a map. When I showed that map of the British Empire zones, the southern part of the United States wasn't included, but the fact is, and again, I did a class that goes more over the history of how slavery was introduced into Britain and, into US, and that it was completely from Britain, especially from the Royal Africa Company. But all to say that there was a fight, and slavery was being abolished in the United States until Thomas Jefferson's presidency, the assassination of Alexander Hamilton, and then it kind of all went down. And the South became more and more dominated by free trade policies and slavery, which go hand in hand, by the way. So here's a map just to show that the southern cotton plantations would then be shipped. It was 75% of this would be shipped to Britain, and Britain also treated its own people awful. I think we've all seen the working conditions during this time. Charles Dickens has also written about the horrors of the treatment of even children in these workhouses. So it's not a color thing. As you know, poor white people in the South too are suffering from this type of economy. So it would be shipped to Britain. Britain conveniently destroyed the textile industry in India, and replaced India as an world opium producer, which they then pushed on the Chinese with 2 opium wars. So by 1840, cotton made up more than half of American exports. However, the North, they were still following the Alexander Hamilton machine tool industry, which again, Frederick Douglass, a former slave, remarks when he escapes from the South and he first enters the North. He's like, my God, you do things so much more cheaply and efficiently here. So this is really what was at head, was that there were two economic systems at that point that were going to have a war for who would dominate. And you can see that the British Empire had invested interest in the South succeeding in this. And again, this idea of free trade, that China didn't have a right to refuse opium, because if there was a demand for it, then it was Britain's right to sell opium to China. In autumn of 1862, this would be the first critical phase of the war, and there was talk that Britain and France were thinking of intervening and actually physically, militarily backing up the Confederate states. So Lincoln sent an urgent letter to Russian Foreign Minister Gorchakov informing him of this, and the Foreign Minister, Gorchakov, wrote in response, "You know that the government of the United States has few friends among the powers. England rejoices over what is happening to you. She longs and prays for your overthrow. France is less actively hostile. Her interests would be less affected by the result, but she is not unwilling to see it. She is not your friend. Your situation is getting worse and worse. The chances of preserving the Union are growing more desperate. Can nothing be done to stop this dreadful war? The hope of reunion is growing less and less, and I wish to impress upon your government that the separation, which I fear must come, will be considered by Russia as one of the greatest misfortunes. Russia alone has stood by you from the first, and will continue to stand by you. We are very, very anxious that some means should be adopted, that any course should be pursued which will prevent the division which now seems inevitable. One separation will be followed by another. You will break into fragments." So President Lincoln was then given the go-ahead to publicize Russia's support, and this held off Britain and France's attack. However, there would be a second critical phase in the war during the summer of 1863. By then, the South's invasion of the North had failed at Gettysburg, and the violent anti-war New York draft riots also failed. Britain was once again thinking of direct military intervention into the war. What would follow marks one of the greatest displays of support for another country's sovereignty to ever occur in modern history. The Russian Navy arrived on both the east and west coastlines of the United States late September and early October 1863. The timing was highly coordinated due to intelligence reports of when Britain and France were intending their military action. The Russian Navy would stay along the U.S. coastline in support of the Union for 7 months. They never intervened in the American Civil War, but rather remained in its waters at the behest of Lincoln in the case of a foreign power's interference. And if you note, so this is a copy of the Naval Historical Foundation. They have a lot of information on this, but it's getting harder and harder on a Google search to get this information. At the bottom of the picture, it states the Russian Squadron in New York, 1863. So, if you guys have any questions, by the way, feel free to say something. So during the 7 months of the Russian Navy, there were celebrations amongst the Civil War. And this is a drawing of one of the parades that occurred through New York. Because the American people were very clear that the Russians had saved them from Britain, because back then it was still, recognized that Britain was no friend to the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, which was always in opposition to the rule of kings. And again, if anyone wants more information, you can visit the Navy Department Library. They have a nice collection of things. So Tsar Alexander II, who held sole power to declare war for Russia, stated in an interview to the American banker Wharton Barker on August 17, 1879, which was later published in The Independent, March 24, 1904, his reason for why he sent the Navy to defend Lincoln's Union. Which, by the way, they had their own problems. You know, it wasn't like they had, a whole bunch of extra Navy to send to different parts of the world. In the autumn of 1862, the governments of France and Great Britain proposed to Russia, in a formal but not in an official way, the joint recognition by European powers of the independence of the Confederate States of America. My immediate answer was, quote, "I will not cooperate in such action, and I will not acquiesce. On the contrary, I shall accept the recognition of the independence of the Confederate States by France and Great Britain as a casus belli for Russia. And in order that the governments of France and Great Britain may understand that this is no idle threat, I will send a Pacific fleet to San Francisco and an Atlantic fleet to New York. All this I did because of love of my own dear Russia, rather than for love of the American Republic. I acted thus because I understood that Russia would have a more serious task to perform if the American Republic, with advanced industrial development, were broken up, and Great Britain should be left in control of most branches of modern industrial development. An official recognition that Great Britain represented slave power, colonial dominance, and that the American concept represented sovereignty." What was Tsar Alexander II referring to exactly when mentioning the advanced industrial development of the American Republic? Well, in short, he was referring to the Hamiltonian system of economics. Notably, Alexander Hamilton's 1791 report on the usefulness of the manufactories in relation to trade and agriculture, which was published in St. Petersburg in 1807, sponsored by Russian Minister of Finance D.A. Guriev, had in its introduction this to say of Hamilton's works: "The similarity of American United Provinces with Russia appears both in the expanse of the land, climate, and natural conditions, in the size of population disproportionate to the space, and in the general youthfulness of various generally useful institutions. Therefore, all the rules, remarks, and means proposed here are suitable for our country." So, just to go through a bit of an overview of like how was this being shaped in Russia, this concept of the American system. In 1842, Tsar Nicholas I hired American George Washington Whistler to oversee the building of the St. Petersburg-Moscow, do I have the right map here? Yes, I do. St. Petersburg to Moscow Railway, Russia's first large-scale railroad. In 1860s, Henry C. Carey's economics, who was the leading advisor of Lincoln's presidency, Henry Carey's economics would be promoted in the St. Petersburg University education system, which was organized by none other than Cassius Clay. Carey was a leading economic advisor, right, and he was the leading Hamiltonian of his age. We'll talk a little bit more of him later. Sergei Witte was the Russian Minister of Finance from 1889 to 91, and later became Prime Minister in 1905 of Russia, would publish in 1889 the incredibly influential paper titled National Savings and Friedrich List, which resulted in a new customs law for Russia. Friedrich List, again, was very much influenced by Hamilton. He wrote this, he made it clear. This new customs law for Russia in 1891 resulted in an exponential growth increase in Russia's economy. Lincoln's Pacific Railroad Superintendent, General Grenville Dodge, advised Russia on its Trans-Siberian Railroad built with Pennsylvania steel and locomotives from 1890 to 1905. There's a joke later on when the Chinese were also starting to adopt these policies that the British sent the Chinese opium and the Americans sent them Pennsylvania steel locomotives. Very much likened to what China is doing today with these projects. You see what the IMF and the World Bank are doing, and then you see what the Chinese are doing, and it's like night and day. So in 1890, in his budget report, Sergei Witte, echoing the Belt and Road Initiative unfolding today, wrote, "The railroad is like a leaven, which creates a cultural fermentation among the population. Even if it passed through an absolutely wild people along its way, it would raise them in a short time to the level requisite for its operation." Sergei Witte was explicit of his following of the American model of political economy when he described his reorganization of the Russian railways, saying, "Faced by a serious shortage of locomotives, I invented and applied in the traffic system, which had long been in practice in the United States, and which is now known as the American system."
Small, yeah.
Yeah, while the British Empire was busy creating wars across the world, with the Crimean War with the Russians, the Opium War with the Chinese, and the suppression of the vast Indian uprisings, which we will have a class on in about 2 weeks' time, the power alliance between Russia and America was still the worst nightmare of the British Empire. And so just to get people to understand that the Bering Strait connection is a 150-year idea, which was very much formulated during the lifetimes of Lincoln and Alexander II, which was, again, as I was saying, it's going to solidify this common view of economy for not just their own countries, but it would ultimately be a decision for the world that would no longer be led under a system of empire. So Stoichkov, who is the Russian ambassador to the US, was one of the leading instrumental figures for the Alaska Purchase, which was absolutely imperative if the Bering Strait were to take off. And he got the go-ahead when he went back to Russia by all the important people. And I don't need to, I think, read this quote because it just really solidifies further what we've already heard, which is that it is in Russia's best interest that the United States prosper and that they're linked together with this idea of economy. So it was pushed through. As soon as Stoichkov arrived and he talked to Seward on the evening of March 29th, 1867, he said, "Yeah, so Russia gave the go-ahead for you to buy Alaska, so yeah, we can meet tomorrow." And Seward's like, "We're going to work on this right now." And they worked throughout the whole night and they got it done. And these people, what I call what do you call them? Professional breadwinner historians, the kind of people who care more about their money and their title and they rewrite history.
Bread scholars.
They call Seward, that the Alaska Purchase was the folly of Seward, but actually it was one of the most important things that has ever occurred in history, world history, for diplomacy, world diplomacy, because the Bering Strait was to link the world.
Yes.
And it's really a travesty. These historians are either very ignorant or they're despicable for saying this about Seward. And Seward himself said that this was the most important thing he ever did in his life. So, Britain.
That's really something. And this is the guy who helped Lincoln save the Union from collapsing in the Civil War.
Yeah.
He's saying that the Alaska Purchase is the most important thing he's ever done in his life.
But it is one of the most important purchases in history.
Yeah.
Period. Because if the United States didn't have Alaska, and it's under British rule, there's no way in hell Russia's going to connect to Canada.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
So thank God
Just
it's
look at this
the
map.
US, under the US Constitution.
So basically looking down.
Yeah.
From the very
So,
north, all the several places, all just one big.
Britain knew that it had still a playing hand. I mean, this is the thing. They joke about Alaska because Alaska today is not developed and it was never linked up as it should be. So these are people who, you know, if people understood their history, they would recognize this as like you're talking about something that would have benefited the world and you're laughing at the fact that it never happened. Like, who do you work for?
And you're ignoring the arsonists who sabotaged it the whole time.
Yeah. So the Britain recognized that British Columbia was going to be the essential component. So British Columbia was the missing link in this. I'm sorry, my friends. I've lived here too. And so they understood that if British Columbia were to get joined up in this, it was over for the naval power of the British Empire. Whoops. And and at the time too, like British Columbia, they're very isolated from England and they're getting nothing. They're actually bankrupt colony. And the United States, despite there being a civil war, they're in a better off place, if you can imagine, the North economically. And British Columbia was very much thinking of joining up with California.
Absolutely.
There was a bit of a mischance. Matt wrote about this. Actually, there was a real mischance. And obviously, if you look into further the history of the United States, which is constantly a civil war, you know, it's never been just like the official civil war periods, but there's always been an opposition of a continuation of empire versus what actually was the basis of the Declaration of Independence. But in 1872, there was the Alabama claims where the British were found guilty in the first international court trial of intervening in the Civil War. Illegally, okay? It was illegal to do this. And so Britain was caught in a bit of a vulnerable position, and they're like, what do you want? And so there was some, you know, I don't know the details of these people, but they obviously, Seward and Sumner were asking for basically British Columbia because they wanted their vision.
They wanted all
fulfilled.
of Canada.
They wanted all.
$2 billion.
Maybe they shouldn't have said that. Maybe they should have just said British Columbia, but even then they probably would not. They would not have got it. But instead, embarrassingly, these Americans, I don't know if they're real Americans, they settled for $15 million that was not even going to be paid until like 10 years later. So they completely missed out on this opportunity to claim British Columbia. Tsar Nicholas II, he's a mixed bag. However, to his credit, he wanted to continue the Trans-Siberian Rail, which was completed in 1905 through the Bering Strait connection. And you know, there's a quote from the New York Times talking about how he was like, you know, completely serious about this. There were $250 to $300 million involved, and they were encouraging Russia, France, and the United States to take bonds. France is always a bit of a mixed bag. It's sometimes with Britain, it's sometimes not with Britain. So in 1876, Henry C. Carey organized the Centennial Exhibition, which is a really big deal, and like a lot of people don't talk about it enough, but there were 10 million people who came to this from around the world, from 37 countries, to Philadelphia to see the achievements of the United States that despite the Civil War occurring, despite Lincoln being assassinated, 10 years later, following Henry C. Carey's economics, which he continued to live on, the United States was undoubtedly the leader in economy. But not only that, they wanted to share how they did it with the world. 3 years later, Otto von Bismarck broke from, which is a picture that you see here, he broke from Germany's free trade system, the British system, implementing an American-style tariff policy for Germany. The kinship between Germany and the United States became so strong at this time that Otto von Bismarck's speech in the German parliament, which I'll read shortly, was also repeated by he wasn't president at the time, McKinley, on the floor of the US Congress. So he says, "A success of the United States in material development is the most illustrious of modern time. The American nation has not only successfully borne and suppressed the most gigantic and expensive war of all history," which is quite something considering you had like the 100 Years' War in Europe, "but immediately afterward disbanded its army, found employment for all its soldiers and marines, paid off most of its debt, given labor and homes to all the unemployed in Europe as fast as they could arrive within its territory, and still by a system of taxation so indirect as not to be perceived, much less felt. Because it is my deliberate judgment that the prosperity of America is mainly due to its protective laws, I urge that Germany has now reached that point where it is necessary to imitate the tariff system of the United States." So now we have Russia and we have Germany. So Otto von Bismarck would propose the Berlin to Baghdad rail, which, if this had been a success when Otto von Bismarck proposed it, it was completed much later. It was completed in 1940. Okay, Otto von Bismarck died in around the 1890s, so there was a real delay on this. The Sykes-Picot disaster would never have occurred. The whole carving up of the Middle East, the shit show that we see in the Middle East, would never have been if the Berlin to Baghdad rail had occurred.
The Ottoman Empire might not have collapsed and might have performed as well and modernized at that time.
Very good point.
Yes.
Very good point.
You want to give this piece? No. You could totally give this
Sorry.
class. You could totally give this class.
Sorry.
I'm using a lot of his words.
Thanks.
Anyway, all right. So Henry C. Carey. So this system, it's spreading through the world. I'm going to go through some other countries that were adopting the American system. And again, it was never meant as like an American dominant system. It was a system for everyone. And Henry C. Carey talks about this in an explicit way of what was this vision for the world in his Harmony of Interest in 1851. You want to read it, Matt?
I vote for Kurt or Ken. Or John.
My accent's not so good.
I vote for Kurt or Don.
Right from the beginning?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two systems are before the world. The one looks to increasing the proportion of persons and of capital engaged in trade and transportation, and therefore to diminishing the proportion engaged in producing commodities with which to trade, with necessarily diminished return to the labor of all, while the other looks to increasing the proportion engaged in the work of production and diminishing that engaged in trade and transportation, with increased return to all, giving to the laborer good wages, and to the owner of capital goods profits. One looks to pauperism, ignorance, depopulation, and barbarism, the other to increasing wealth, comfort, intelligence, combination of action and civilization. One looks towards universal war, the other towards universal peace. One is the English system, the other we may be proud of to call the American system, for it is the only one ever devised, the tendency of which was that of elevating while equalizing the condition of man throughout the world.
So I think at this point it's becoming very clear the British Empire free trade policy versus the Leibniz, Alexander von Humboldt, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Henry C. Carey's idea of economy that was uniquely something that the United States put forth into the world in opposition to empire. There really was not a competent form to combat empire before this. This is very big, and we shouldn't, despite our dislike of what the United States has become today, we shouldn't wash over that. It's important because it's based on a universal principle. It's based on a concept of truthful basis for economic development. And we risk that we lose that, and then we make ourselves more vulnerable to systems of empire, to systems of oligarchy, by thinking that everything that came from the United States we should hate today. So America's Civil War was actually a contest for the whole world. It was two systems battling within one country, but it was a vision for the whole world. And Lincoln's nationalist supporters carried their revolution abroad to Germany, Russia, Ireland, Japan with the Meiji Restoration, China with Sun Yat-sen, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, and other nations. Unfortunately, a lot of those were not fully developed because of sabotage. Anton Chaikin, he's gone through a lot of this in more detail, which I won't go through right now. In terms of Japan, I'm not going to say too much. Just the Meiji Restoration, which was incredibly important to Japan, was directly from Henry C. Carey Networks, and it was Britain's disorganizing of Japan. A lot of people got disorganized for World War I and World War II to occur, which was again to split what was the spread of the American system. These world wars were basically to get people concentrated again on local affairs, local drama, and they lost sight of the bigger vision. So here's a picture of Sun Yat-sen's 3 Principles of the People, very much influenced by Lincoln, and Friedrich List, who was very much influenced by Hamilton. So we're close to the end. I just wanted to mention McKinley's tariff of 1890. This was a big deal. McKinley was kind of, in some ways, the last stand before the FDR fight that Matt's going to go over. McKinley was the last president to have fought in the Civil War. He enhanced trade with the countries of South America and Mexico and maintained common protection against Britain's free trade policy. So protectionism, we have to put it into context. It was protection against the British Empire's free trade, specifically. And this effectively shut out, the McKinley Tariff effectively shut out Britain from the entirety of the West Indies and South America. So obviously this guy had to go, right? So there's a quote from him. He said, "Free trade may be suitable to Great Britain and its peculiar social and political structure, but it has no place in this republic, where classes are unknown and where caste has long since been banished, where equality is a rule, where labor is dignified and honorable, where education and improvement are the individual striving of every citizen, no matter what may be the accident of his birth or the poverty of his early surroundings. Here, the mechanic of today is the manufacturer of a few years hence. Under such conditions, free trade can have no abiding place here." And this is,
Here.
he said this as a rebuke on free trade in the House of Representatives in 1882. So here are just a list of assassinations. I know I'm ending on a bit of a, but it's because
What a downer.
people say like, oh, well, if the United States was so great, why isn't the world a better place, right? Kind of like what Voltaire did to Leibniz with Candide. It's like, oh, the world is such an awful place. Like, why are we going to say that the potential of mankind is something good? Well, these are not natural phenomenons necessarily when good things don't work out. Sometimes they're sabotaged. So President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, 4 weeks after his inauguration. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated 1881. President Garfield was assassinated 1881. Otto von Bismarck was ousted by 1890. President of France, Sadi Carnot, assassinated 1894, also Republican. Tsar Alexander III poisoned 1894. President McKinley assassinated 1901. You're going to notice there's a lot of Americans and Russians specifically in this list. Vyacheslav von Plehve, I'm sorry if I pronounced that badly, Russian Minister of the Interior, assassinated 1904. He was working closely with Sergei Witte on economic projects. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, assassinated 1905, also the same. Russia Minister of Interior Pyotr Stolypin, Prime Minister from 1906 to 1911, assassinated 1911. They're all working on what Sergei Witte had branched off of. Tsar Nicholas II, who called for the Bering Strait, assassinated 1918. President of China Sun Yat-sen, forced to step down after less than 1 year. Even though China loves him, he was forced to step down from January. He only had his presidency from January 1st to March 10th, 1912. Now the Chinese don't like to talk about this too much, but that was definitely from foreign intervention. That was not a natural. They like to romanticize it, like, oh, he obviously this means he didn't care about power and blah blah blah. Why become the president, right? So to end with this note, but with the follow-up of Matt, who is the optimist of us two and the optimist of also this conference. No, he's converted me to optimism, don't worry. It wasn't that. So, Lincoln's statue, which if anyone has not visited Washington, D.C., despite all of the disgustingness of Washington, D.C., there's also a lot of beauty in it. The Capitol Hill is actually a very beautiful, beautiful building. On top of Lincoln's statue, it says, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people, for whom he saved the Union." That is all of America, not just the North. The memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. And we'll end here on a quote by President Lincoln when he was in a debate. Before he became president, in 1858, he was debating the slave powers champion Stephen Douglas for the presidency, and he said, "That is the issue that will continue into this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. That is, when we no longer shall be. It is the eternal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face from the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings."
Welcome back, friends. Welcome back to Solutions Watch. James Corbett here, CorbettReport.com. Story time. So, it was about a decade ago, probably 2011-ish, on New Year's Day specifically, when I opened up my Skype in order to Skype home to Canada to give a Happy New Year to my family back home in Canada. And I had a few different direct messages from a few different people who didn't necessarily know each other, but they were all messaging me to say, "Happy birthday, James," which was very confusing because my birthday is not New Year's Day. So why are multiple different people wishing me a happy birthday? It did take me several minutes of thinking about it before I realized, oh yeah, I think back when I first set up my Skype account, which would have been years prior at that point, I think it probably did ask me for my birth date, and I assume at the time it was just to make sure you're over 18 or something like that. But anyway, I, of course, did what everyone does, right? January 1st, 1907. Of course. When were you born? I was born January 1st, 1907. Of course I didn't put in my actual birth date. No one really puts in their real birth date in something like that, do they? Do they? Well, evidently the people on the other end of that those Skype conversations seem to believe that that was indeed my birthday, and I guess Skype had been toying with some sort of feature where they were going to send your friends some kind of reminder about your birthday. I don't know. I never got it before. I never got it again, so I don't know why it happened, but just that particular year I got some happy birthday messages on New Year's Day. And that was an interesting moment, but also a moment that did give me a little bit of satisfaction to know that salting your data certainly does pay off sometimes in weird ways. Yes, salting your data. A very simple practice, but one that I again, it boggles my mind that anyone would give their actual real data about themselves online into some program or some sign up for this kind of thing, unless you are legally obligated, unless you are signing some sort of legal document in which you will be sued or put in jail for perjury or something. Why on earth would you give your real data in that instance? Of course I was born January 1st, 1907. I'm 114 years young, and haven't died of COVID yet. Right? Of course we're all doing this, right? Well, if not, I suggest that it might be a good idea for you to start. Do not give out your real personal data online in places where you don't need to do so. Or if you do, at least do it consciously and with purpose and for reason. Don't do it willy-nilly. Because not only, of course, is this data a treasure trove for all sorts of criminals, conmen, shysters, people who can hack into databases and what have you and pilfer out details, but of course also the real criminals in positions of real power, the big techers, the government toadies, all of these people, of course, are very hungry for your data. Why would you willingly feed it to them? And that is, of course, particularly important in this age as we plunge into the COVID-19 84 biosecurity nightmare police state, then where of more and more just wrongthink of various sorts is getting people put onto lists. Are you an extremist? Perhaps you're a domestic terrorist. You have some wrongthink there. We have to be very careful about where we are putting our data and in what context and how we are doing so. A point that I made in a recent talk that I had with Ernest Hancock on the Declare Your Independence radio program, where I talk to him every Thursday, and we had a talk recently about this very subject, and when it comes to these sorts of online data treasure troves that are out there, waiting for some government alphabet soup-like agency to come along and snarf all that data up.
I had a patron, big supporter, really pressuring me to join Patriot something. It was Ammon Bundy's group, and Ammon Bundy
right.
has a kind of a freedom cell thing. But when you go through it, it's kind of, I remember this from 94 around in there when the militia of Montana and the Michigan militia and all these guys, they sent out to everyone that was, we had Second Amendments for everyone. So, woohoo, man, you're a militia, we're like, no, we're just don't want to be restricted on gun carry. But we got a floppy disk, those little hard floppy disks, and you put it in, and it was a program, list all the people, all their cars, all their guns, all their ammunition, all their, armored personnel carriers, and put this in here and then send it to Central Command and we'll know what. I'm like, are you stupid? So I'm seeing that same kind of thing. They go, what is your assets? What can you bring to the table? How are you going? I'm going, whoa, time out. So freedom cells, as you do freedom cells, it's kind of a little bit the same thing, but what are your skills? What are you going to do? I'm going, I don't need that. So when anybody calls me after we've done our solution, say, well, what group do I do? How am I going? Well, I suggest freedom cells, but it's the same thing. You're just getting on this.
Yeah. It's a good point. You absolutely do have to be careful about what you reveal and what you don't, and to whom, and in what circumstances, and where is this information going.
Right.
You should always, 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 always be careful about that. That's a good point. That's why, yeah, I keep saying freedom cells because that's the concept, but I'm not necessarily promoting everyone should go to this website and put their information and geographical location in this website, because regardless of the intentions of the people creating it, that's the kind of data treasure mine that obviously the big techers and the NSAers and everyone else know how to exploit and are very hungry to exploit. So yeah, centralizing that kind of information.
Meetup was the same kind of fun. Meetups worked really well until it did.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, to me, it's about finding those people, and then you have nothing whatsoever to do with any sort of central, or you know, once you've got your group and you know the people and you can interact with them without having to go through some website or something, then maybe you can find other pods or whatever, other groups of people that way. But yeah, you got to be careful with that stuff. Always. Okay. And this is why I always recommend salting your data. Never give your 100% accurate data about yourself into any sort of online anything.
And subscribe to Ferret Magazine.
Yeah. You've told that story. I remember.
I mean, yeah, I go Ferret Magazine and Lego World or something. I mean, just to throw them off. Okay,
well, actually, my children would love if I subscribed to Lego World. So
okay.
Once again, that was Ernest Hancock on Declare Your Independence, and I do talk to him every single week, so you can look into the Declare Your Independence archives for more of our previous conversations. But in that conversation, we were talking about these types of movements that come up online and how they seek details, sometimes very specific details from you about your very personal information, and why it might not be a good idea to simply blindly volunteer that information, even if the people on the other end of that transaction are angels. Well, of course, they're not the only people who are going to be on the other end of that transaction, because as we know, the very trunk lines of the internet itself are controlled, surveilled, constantly monitored by the alphabet supers. Of course, I mean, just one example, of course, we all know about Room 641 and the NSA looking in the trunk lines, and that was information that was coming out from Mark Klein and other whistleblowers 15 plus years ago now. So that's very old news, yes. And with the erection of the Salt Lake City data center and all of this, we know the NSA is snarfing up every single piece of electronic information that goes through the internet, so never assume that anything is secure. So the way that I look at this is like this. I call it salting your data. I realize salting is a particular term within the world of cryptography to data that sort of extra input to data that's used to hash passwords, etc. And in order to make it a little bit harder to crack. I am using it in the sense of putting in false or misleading information about yourself here and there in order to not simply just give away all of your valuable information about who you are, personally identifiable information. To the extent that it's possible, you should have an online persona that is different than your real world persona and that has different details, including birth date and everything else. And why use the same birth date all the time? It's not always January 1st, 1907. Sometimes it's January 1st, 1932. whatever I'm feeling like that particular day. And it's not always January 1st. And I think that's probably a good way to proceed forward. Now, people who are interested in that story that Ernest Hancock mentioned at the very tail end of that clip there of our conversation, he's related the story a few times in our conversations over the years that of a friend of his who he was perplexed to find subscribes to Ferret Monthly Magazine. What? Like, well, you don't have a ferret? Like, of course, that's the point. It'll keep them confused. Well, of course, that was probably back in the day where people actually subscribed to physical magazines, but the idea applies also for online. Why not? Why not sign up for Lego World or what have you, just to throw some monkey wrenches into the works of anyone who is trying to pilfer your data or collect an online profile about you. It's just basic operational security to not give away all your data and not to make it openly available. For example, in that conversation, we're talking about various sites where people might be giving personally identifiable information, like something like Freedom Cells, which I've talked about before, but as I say, I don't think Freedom Cells is the be-all and end-all and the only place that people should be going. But if you do choose to sign up at a place like Freedom Cells, as even I believe it was a Derek or John, perhaps both of them have said, it will ask you for your location. Don't give your actual home address. Pick something, a park down the street or something. Well, I would say pick something in your general regional area, maybe generally in your county or wherever you live, but certainly nothing that will be close to where you live. And don't give any personally identifiable details about yourself unless and until such time as you know who is on the other end of that transaction. And even then, why not arrange that offline rather than online? Be careful about where you are giving your data. And as I say, that's just generally true. I mean, there are just criminals on the internet who are interested in that type of information, let alone, as I say, the bigger criminals, the alphabet supers and others, who are increasingly going to be using personally identifiable information to find you and to question you. Suddenly, everyone who had a picture of themselves taken at the January 6th insurrection, that unforgettable moment in American history that will go down forever, is that, that was so close to a coup. It almost happened, that the entire government was almost taken out in one swift blow. And so now everyone who happened to be in the area, everyone whose cell phone was pinging in at that particular time, gets all their information snarfed up, gets a knock on the door from the FBI. Why were you in Washington on that day? That sort of thing is actually starting to happen, and we are only at the beginning of this headlong plunge into COVID-1984 insanity and everything else that's coming in the coming years. So yeah, it might be a good idea to not necessarily be giving out your personal details and to muddy up the waters with creative information about yourself that may or may not be true, stuffed in here and there. Again, I think that's just generally speaking a good idea. Of course, specifically good for people who are working specifically in these areas that are where people are going to be targeted by governments, etc. in the future. Now, this might sound like just obvious, mundane, of course, what are you talking about? Everyone knows this, James, to people who have lived in particularly obviously and egregiously in your face tyrannical societies, Chinese or others who may be tuning in via VPN or what have you. But for people who have thought themselves to be living in free and open societies where, yeah, you can talk about these things and they'll just ignore you. Well, there has been space for that in previous decades. I would not rely on that space to always exist. So salting data, putting in fake things, creating profiles, fake logins here and there, and just making sure that if someone was trying to assemble some sort of online persona of you, that they wouldn't necessarily have all the details, and they might wish you a happy birthday on January 1st. By all means, yeah, 1907, sure, why not? So, all that being said, I know that Canadians of a certain age will remember Jean Chrétien's infamous remark about the pepper spray at the protest. Was it an APEC protest? Where he said, "As for me, pepper, I put it on my plate, ha ha ha." Echoing Jean Chrétien, I might say, as for me, salt, I put it on my data. I hope you do too. Just a word to the wise. James Corbett, CorbettReport.com.